It's hypocritical that the party that always advocated for less government control and claimed to be all about families in a religious context is certainly acting contrary to that. I mean, you cannot have any more government control than state intervention in one's medical decision-making and one's bodies.
Hi, my name is Frank Schaeffer, and this is a podcast called In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. We put it live on Facebook, it goes to YouTube, then it goes everywhere podcasts go. And I'm talking today with someone who I have chatted with before on this podcast, and that's Civia Tamarkin, who is both a filmmaker and a journalist. She's someone that has thought a lot about and been active in terms of involvement with the issue of choice, abortion rights, women's issues. And today we're going to be talking about some of that. We also have a clip from the film she made, Birthright, a war story, that we are going to show in a moment. So Civia, why don't you say hi, and then we'll go to the clip, and then we're going to talk.
Absolutely. Well, hello, and thank you for having me on your program again. This seems to be a topic that is just exacerbating every time we speak. Yep. So I welcome the opportunity to explore all the nuances, and certainly far from the nuances, the reality of what is happening.
Let me ask you one question about this clip we're going to see, which I just watched earlier, but how long is the film itself, Birthright, a war story? We're watching something about a minute and a half or so from it, but how long is the actual film?
The film is 90 minutes.
Right, I gathered that. So this is a clip, and forgive my ignorance, but is it a sort of a trailer for the whole project, or is it a clip from the 90 minutes?
These are clips spliced together from the 90 minutes to frame the issue that we are discussing here about policing pregnancy.
Yeah, I thought it was terrific as a picture, and I just wanted to let you explain that a little. So with no further ado, these are some clips from Birthright, a war story. Civia Tamarkin is the filmmaker. We're going to have a chance to talk all about this. Let's watch the clip. Ernie, if you could roll that for us, please. Ernie's our producer, and let's get that going.
So the notion that abortion can be recriminalized and women won't go to jail is absolutely untrue, and is shown to be untrue by the fact that women in every other country where abortion is illegal go to jail, and that women here in the United States of America are already going to jail. Women who've suffered miscarriages and stillbirths, couldn't guarantee a healthy birth outcome, who did something, gave birth to a healthy baby, but somebody believed something they did during their pregnancy created a risk of harm, endangered that baby, and women who have attempted abortions are going to jail.
I honestly didn't think I did anything wrong. I didn't understand that it was illegal to self-induce.
If you carry the personhood statutes to their logical extreme and say that life begins at conception, then what you're saying is that the state has the right to intervene in a woman's life from the second she becomes pregnant. Intervene in a big way, such as saying what you can take, can't take, what you can do and can't do. And that's an intrusion in the life of an individual that should shock every true conservative in this country.
Yeah, so there's the clip. And the film, by the way, before we get into it, where is the film available, Civia? Where can people see the whole thing?
The film is on a variety of streaming platforms. Certainly some of the obvious ones like YouTube and Vimeo and Apple iTunes, but it's also available without charge on Pluto, Tubi, Vudu. So it's out there.
So first of all, I would just urge people to find the movie and to watch it. And I think Ernie will put some links up to various places people can watch it that'll go with this podcast wherever we put it up. So Civia, before we get into the issues, I know I've had you on before, but there'll be folks who are watching or listening to this who don't know you or me well enough to understand our background on this. So why don't you start by telling me a little about yourself and your life journey, what you've done, and then how you were pulled into the particular issue of women's reproductive rights. At what point did that happen? If you can give us a couple minutes on that so we can frame our discussion by understanding you a little better.
Certainly. Well, I must admit that I was, in my youth, an activist for women's rights in the 60s, early 70s. But I had a long career as a journalist, and particularly as an investigative journalist and news executive. And I have always strived to connect the dots in my reporting, to give contextual understanding to either readers when I was in print or to viewers when I was at ABC News, CNN, et cetera. So on the heels of the Hobby Lobby decision in 2014, I was shocked at the inroads that the opponents of reproductive rights had made. Could not possibly understand why someone would want to ban contraception. If you're against abortion, why not try to prevent unwanted pregnancies? And so I set out to try to understand how the reproductive health care access movement had been decimated to this point. So, and how aggressive the opposition movement had become. So I decided that I was going to investigate the growth of the movement, the failings of the pro-reproductive rights movement, and try to give it a context. But I didn't want to do a film about abortion. I wanted to do a film about what I call the collateral damage from abortion, because everybody thinks of, first of all, choice is no longer an applicable term. I mean, it was a trope and slogan that certainly seemed to make sense in the activist 60s. It does not describe what is happening, particularly for low-income women, for women of color, for women in many, many parts of this country. If you don't have access or affordability, you have no choice. Without options, there are no choices. This is really more about healthcare. And I was determined to point out what happens when you have state control over every stage of determining whether or not one should give birth, and then the circumstances under which one can give birth. So it really was for me an awakening that the real life Handmaid's Tale was upon us. And I set out to sound the alarms. As somebody said to me recently, you kept yelling the house is on fire, only now that it's to the ground, people paying attention.
Yeah, speaking of which, when did the movie come out? When was the first exposure of Birthright, a War Story, and how did you first show it?
It was released theatrically the summer of 2017.
Okay.
So, nearly 5 years ago, we were sounding the alarms, and I went around the country speaking. I even spoke internationally, and then it was on digital format the following January. It was on Hulu and then subsequently on other streaming platforms. And it's still out there. Women Make Movies has the educational rights, I should say that. It's libraries, universities, schools, etc.
And what's been the reaction in terms of the best reactions, the worst, and then in general, have people paid attention, even though you were ahead of your time talking about things that perhaps are only being taken as seriously as they should be now, as you pointed out? What was the reaction? What's been going on with this movie over the last 5 years? Who all has seen it and how people responded to it?
Well, we had, after the theatrical release, we had a film impact campaign. And a number of organizations showed the film, had film screenings as they registered voters, as they had discussions. They partnered with us, and it's been out there. But I must say that as I spoke, I often felt that I was preaching to the choir. People who came to see this film were people who already were concerned about the issue. And I must admit that the most disappointing factor for me was that there weren't many young people people would say to me, why are you doing this? I'd say, because my 20-something-year-old granddaughters are not. And the people who are really affected by this were not the ones who were heeding the warning. It is disappointing. I mean, it's wonderful to see young people suddenly galvanizing around this, albeit I'm disappointed that many of them are still latching onto same old slogans like, choice, which are no longer applicable, that we realized that was a misnomer. But where were they? Yeah. Their public pressure campaigns are not going to influence the Supreme Court. So what I say is now it's time to really mobilize to take this battle to the ballot box.
Yes. Yeah, which is where it was lost in terms of Donald Trump becoming president with a list from the Federalist Society given him by evangelical leaders like Franklin Graham, saying, look, we'll bring your people to vote for you at arm's length because you're a very smelly human being by evangelical standards, but we'll help you if you do this. And that was the deal. And that's why we've got all these federal judges, not to mention Amy Barrett and all the rest, and Gorsuch and all the rest of them. So, which kind of brings us up to the moment we're in. When you talk about the absence of some of the younger people, I think, what's happening is a kind of a reverse of the Vietnam War protest syndrome, where when the draft went away, all of a sudden the students who had been protesting because they might get drafted, to put it very bluntly, or their boyfriends might get drafted or whatever, just evaporated. It was like the issue of war and peace never changed, but their immediate involvement did. And it's kind of the reverse of that. After Roe, there was an assumption, okay, this is settled now, it's nothing to do with me. There were people like you, Civia, wandering around saying, yes, it is. There's a tsunami coming, and things like the Hobby Lobby decision against contraceptive rights, saying that they don't have to provide contraceptive coverage for their employees because it's an evangelical run company. These are the canaries in the coal mine that all sang and died. You showed up to warn us about that, but now I think younger people feel directly involved and threatened again, but it's a bit late. I don't think the case is hopeless, but it brings up a point that I think needs to be addressed in terms of changing things in the future, and that is that I think folks on the pro-reproductive rights for women side have really failed to play the long game with the intensity that the religious right has. I mean, where is the equivalent of the Federalist Society? Where is the equivalent of the 50-year crusade to change the courts and come up with the lists of people to appoint? We just don't have an equivalent, I think, on our side of the debate. How do you feel about that?
Oh, I fully agree. I mean, what I have been saying is that the opposition was playing a long-term chessboard strategy, and now we're playing pickup jacks.
Yes.
There was never a unity and cohesive effort to defend. I mean, it was a fractured defense line, and that doesn't hold. There was fragmentation within the reproductive rights movement. There was a feeling that the second wave feminists did not understand the issues faced by those who were suffering as a result of the Hyde Amendment, those who did not have access to care. There has been so much fragmentation within the movement. Everybody doesn't speak with one voice. In an effort to be inclusive, it has not been cohesive.
Yeah.
And I have tried many times. I mean, I have even lately tried to pull together various groups with singular messaging. And there are still those who think that you need to desensitize the public. And there are many of us who say, focus on health care and all the implications. Let's just talk about abortion. Let's talk about the implications of these laws on people who have much wanted pregnancies that fail. Yes. People who are carrying dying fetuses and their health is jeopardized. Let's talk about the exemptions here, the horror of not having exemptions for rape and incest. And let's talk about and not forget the male role in this. You know, if you are a 15-year-old male who impregnates another teenager, your parents are going to be paying child support for this fetus. And of course, let's not talk about the fact that the very same people who are forcing childbirth do not care about this fetus once it is born. Who takes care of this? Who pays medical bills? Who will support this fetus? Who will support the family? All of the initiatives to support families have failed.
Yeah, and they failed because the Republicans don't let them exist. It was starting with the child tax credit that lifted millions of children tragically, temporarily out of poverty, gave everybody a glimpse of what could be if we had a little compassion and common sense in our thinking, you know, all the way up until 2 minutes ago, as it were, when they voted against trying to get baby formula to kids in a very temporary baby formula crisis, but nevertheless indicative of where they're at when it comes to actually voting in anything on parental leave for both women and men, when it comes to childcare, when it comes to any of these issues. The Republicans aren't just tepid, they are diametrically opposed to all family policy initiatives that would actually change the quality of life for families. And so, you know, when you and I look at the opposition to abortion rights and the opposition to contraceptives and everything that's coming down the pike, it's bad. And the position is bad enough, but when it's coupled with hypocrisy, it's really intolerable. It becomes a real hissing and a byword, to use the old biblical phrase. I mean, it is disgusting.
Absolutely. It's hypocritical that the party that always advocated for less government control and claimed to be all about families in a religious context is certainly acting contrary to that. I mean, you cannot have any more government control than state intervention in one's medical decision-making and one's bodies.
Yeah.
So, you know, but the goal here is far beyond reproductive health care. You see all the other policies that they are advocating, the book bans, the, you know, censuring of teachers, the muzzling of classroom instruction, the attacks that we thought we were far beyond with the LGBTQ plus community. And one has to take a step back and look at what is their real agenda. And it would appear that their real agenda is to impose a fascist theocracy on this country, to eliminate the separation between church and state. And I think this faith-imposed prescription, if you will, for one's medical decision-making is certainly indicative of that. You know, this is again, as you know better than anyone, is a faith-imposed restrictive climate. I mean, not all religions believe in the personhood, quote unquote, of a fetus, an embryo or a fertilized egg. Judaism certainly does not. But yet, those of us who are Jewish are being subjected to the imposition of another religious faith's tenets.
Yeah, there's two ironies there, and I want to bring both up because my memory is bad sometimes. You remind me if I get too involved in one and forget the other. One is this new wrinkle of libertarian billionaire involvement in the right. Peter Thiel, and now it seems Elon Musk and others who are throwing billions of dollars into what appears to be a switch to kind of the Republican side of politics. That's incredibly hypocritical for people who call themselves libertarian when the entire Republican agenda is a theocracy. So that's one issue of hypocrisy that I'd like to talk about with you here in a minute. But the other is the one that you brought up before, and I just want to add, and I know you know this because you saw that interview I did with Christian Amanpour where I mentioned this, but also you and I have talked about it before. There's a double irony on the side of the evangelicals now, who are so firmly in the anti-abortion camp and anti-women's rights and so forth, And that was, as I well remember, because I was literally in the room, so to speak, with people like Dr. Billy Graham, the evangelist in the 1970s, and Dr. Criswell, who was then president of the Southern Baptist Convention. In the 1970s, when my dad and I and Dr. Schaeffer Coop went out with our anti-abortion propaganda film and book, Whatever Happened to the Human Race, the opposition we ran into was not from women's groups on the left, it was from evangelicals who were pro-choice. And I think a lot of people don't realize when you talk about there are many religions that are not against abortion as such, one of them was American white evangelical Christianity, that in the 1970s was very split on the issue. For instance, backing Ronald Reagan when he legalized abortion in California, that went along quite happily with Rockefeller, who was another Republican, legalizing abortion in New York. Criswell preached a sermon on why he thought Roe v. Wade was a good idea, that women should have this right. Dr. Graham, Billy Graham, the great evangelist, father of Franklin Graham, the right-wing activist today, refused to be involved with our campaign to bring the Roman Catholic view of abortion into the Protestant community. They said that's a Catholic issue, it's not ours. So your point is well taken, but what people who are watching this or listening to this podcast have to understand, that evangelicals themselves had to be indoctrinated and changed to bring them into the misogynist anti-abortion camp. And that's a change that very few people have reported on significantly, because it changes everything. It means that we don't have to look at the evangelical group as a kind of a monolithic whole. We can say, hey, your parents and grandparents a lot of them were pro-choice. What happened to you? Why did this suddenly become your issue? So I just want to throw that out there. And then I remind you of the other point I made about Peter Thiel and Musk and these others who seem to be throwing their lot in with the Republicans, or at least the right wing these days. And I think that's another wrinkle that we have yet to face.
Well, first of all, contextually, let's remember that the Republican Party itself, the chair of the Republican Party back in 72,
yes,
was very much in favor of legalizing abortion and allowing everyone to make their own bodily, autonomy, medical decision based on bodily autonomy. That you know better than most, as you said, you were in the room, that abortion became a political weapon. It was a way for the Republicans to open the big tent and the coffers by bringing in the evangelical groups.
Right.
So it was not based on moral philosophy. It was not based on anything but political leverage. I mean, interestingly, as you say, Ronald Reagan legalized abortion as governor of California, but when he ran in 79 for the 80 election, he suddenly did an about face and a lot of mea culpas. I'm sorry I did that. It was politically advantageous. So it was not about beliefs. That has subsequently become entwined with the entire propaganda machine, with the lexicon of propaganda. I mean, there is no such thing as a partial birth abortion. There is labor and delivery of later-term pregnancies. There is no heart at 6 weeks, even though the opposition would pass heartbeat bans. There is a tube with cells that indicates a flutter movement, but the heart is not fully formed at 6 weeks. And the idea of pain at 20 weeks, again, these are misnomers. There are reflexive responses. Much of the literature, the evidence-based scientific literature, indicates that pain, as we would define pain, is also a, experiential response, but until the cortex is fully attached to the brain and the nervous system is attached to the brain, that it is not pain. But they have developed this propaganda machine. They have kept their eye on the prize. I have a soundbite in the film where Carol Tobias, who then was president of National Right to Life, looked in the camera and she said, We are going to nibble away at Roe v. Wade until we get to the Supreme Court and they say this was a stupid decision and overturn it. Now, I shot that interview in 2016.
Yeah.
And the entire strategy that they have had since Roe, the youth camps, the youth indoctrination camps, grooming 2 generations to run for local political office, school boards where they would ban sex education, moving on to the state level, to Congress, came to a head in 2010 with the Tea Party, and then exponentially grew from there.
Well, and then one little wrinkle to that is that Amy Coney Barrett came from one of those groups because she's a Roman Catholic, but she also was part of another group that had a lot of evangelicals in it, that where her family raised her in this very patriarchal tradition that went even beyond what the Roman Catholic Church teaches in terms of men being in charge and women having to defer to them and so forth. And she became a law student and went through the whole system with the Federalist Society, very much being groomed for the position she finally did hold. So, you know, there are actual people who went through this process of homeschooling or being in some small cultic little group or going to an evangelical university or whatever it may be, who then did show up within the system. And they're now sitting in judges' robes in various courts across the country, thanks to Donald Trump and the Republicans. Let me just pause to say that you are watching and or listening to a podcast with Frank Schaeffer. That's me. It is called In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. Today, my guest is Civia Tamarkin, and she is a filmmaker and a journalist and an historian, I think I could say as well, in giving us a lesson about where all this came from. She made a movie that we watched a clip from earlier, and that is from Birthright, a war story. It is available on YouTube and in many other places. We will put links to that film with this podcast wherever it shows up, so you can find it easily. So, Civia, let me just turn the page a little bit and go back. I think that one mistake that was made with Roe, there were two things happening, and this is not a rhetorical question. I really want to discuss this with you as if no one else is listening to it. So let's just call this over a drink or a cup of coffee here. As you look back over the years as someone who lived through this, as I did, on the other side of the issue at that time, and now very much in agreement with you, I'm wondering strategically if those who were arguing for abortion rights made a mistake with Roe. I'm not talking about the legalization of abortion, but I'm talking about counting on a Supreme Court decision to kind of win the argument and then just move on, like, okay, we're done here now. And as I look back on it, 2 things that stand out that I think this generation of people don't understand. 1, many evangelicals and Republicans were pro-choice. 2, abortion was being legalized state by state, even by the ultra-conservative governor of California. It seems to me that historians, when the passion is taken out of the discussion, historians are going to look at Roe v. Wade itself as problematic. I don't mean the legalization of abortion. I mean putting all our eggs in one basket as if somehow this would solve the issue, when in fact, I think Roe itself exacerbated the debate in a way that might have been unnecessary. I don't know whether it was or not. And that's where I'm really throwing this open for discussion. How do you really see this in hindsight? Because it's going to be struck down. It's going to be changed. So in that sense, you can say, well, Roe did fail in that it was overturned. I'm wondering if there would have been a similar move to overturn state by state, including the southern states, the bastions of evangelical Christianity, that with people like Criswell, who were pro-choice in the Southern Baptist community, being on the right side of this issue while being on the wrong side of many other issues. I just wonder if looking back historically 100 years from now, we're going to say, boy, that was a tactical error. Something was not thought through in the way Roe was pushed through. And like I say, I don't have an opinion. This is a rhetorical question, not rhetorical question. I'm throwing this out to you for a real discussion. I'd really like to talk with you about that.
Well, I think the mistake was in believing we had the security of stare decisis, in thinking that once you have precedent in Supreme Court decisions, they will not be overturned.
Yeah.
And when there is an inherent constitutional right that is the foundation of that decision, as the 14th Amendment right to privacy was with this. What, of course, becomes problematic as a side note, if that is overturned here, we all know the unraveling of other rights, whether it is LGBTQ rights, Griswold with contraception, even Loving versus Virginia with interracial marriage. It would have been a mistake to leave it up to the states, because prior to Roe, all you had was California, East New York, East Coast, few patches in between, nothing codified. And so it would have been subject to the vagaries of every state legislative change. What we needed, and what so many people were going for, and including the opposition, which they will indeed continue to push, is a federal law, have something codified into federal law. Unfortunately, WIPA, the Women's Health Protection Act, just failed in the Senate.
Yes.
Passed the House. But what you need is a federal law which will supersede the variations in state laws and policies. All of the states that had bans on the books, those are all on injunctive hold because of Roe, and could very well be brought into, some are trigger laws, which will immediately go into effect. In other states that have laws, there will be attorney generals or county attorneys who will go to court seeking a special action to overturn them. So yes, the mistake was not to go for a national law. I'm guessing they may have, and even Ruth Bader Ginsburg took issue with finding the anchor in the 14th Amendment.
Yeah.
However, I think that they may have also calculated that the possibility of having this federal law codified would be difficult. We saw what happened, had ERA been ratified in a timely fashion. I mean, now it has been again, but now there's, discrepancies about extending the timetable and so on. Had that been ratified, that might have covered it.
Yes.
But the goal was, of course, to have federal policies to supersede the states.
Yeah, but the thing is, I think that what we forget is that people who now are firmly entrenched because of political policy issues, I look back at people like Paul Weyrich, who is the right-wing activist, Roman Catholic, really kind of a nutcase, but he was rubbing his hands in glee at the prospect of turning abortion into what it became. And that was the gift that kept on giving, literally in terms of financial fundraising, but also if we can just energize those Protestants to the level that our more conservative Roman Catholics are energized, we'll really have something here. And, he talked so many people like Jerry Falwell and others into that point of view.
Exactly.
They had been energetic on things like fighting for segregation. Jerry Falwell was a segregationist, and they were losing that battle. They were furious because Jimmy Carter, who was an integrationist and a non-racist white Christian, became president, and they wanted a more true white nationalist conservatism. And so it all played into that. So when I ask questions about Roe, it's not from the point of view of blaming people who fought for that. It's just looking back and realizing that there's always two sides to these things. And tactically, I think I tend to agree with you. I think it's a pity that it didn't become a matter of law through the Senate and Congress, that at that point in history, we're not as we're not divided on this litmus test issue the way they are today. It just didn't have the energy behind it that we do now. So of course that bridge will never be crossed again, and we're where we are, which brings me to the next point, and that is how do you think things unfold now? First of all, what do you think is going to happen? I think Roe will be overturned, and then what? And then how do you see this playing out in terms of the ability to energize folks, younger people, to vote? And let's just cut right to the chase for Democratic candidates who oppose the Republican Party's slow march towards theocracy? What is the chance of waking up the younger generation to the reality of that? Because I don't think they don't even understand, perhaps many of them, what those words mean and what they imply. They look at Iran or Saudi Arabia and they say, well, that has nothing to do with us. But of course, we have theocracies in the planet now, and their people are very oppressed. You know, all these women in Afghanistan who are all having to cover their faces again. We see this all around us, but I don't think a lot of Americans make the connection with our own white nationalist Christian movement, understanding that people like Jenny Thomas, for instance, Clarence Thomas's wife, in the best of all worlds, this will be a, quote, Christian nation in that very same way that Iran is an Islamic nation. Do people get this? And how do you think this plays out?
Well, not only do people not get that, but they also do not see the reality of the intersectional relationship between abortion abolitionists and Christian militia and white supremacists.
Right.
This is absolutely, I like to use the term now, reproductive oppression. And reproductive oppression is white supremacy.
Yes.
And Monica Simpson from Sister Song is the one who has been saying this for years. We are talking about the fear. I mean, we saw it manifest. There is a connection between the shooting and what we're seeing with the anti-reproductive rights movement.
Yes.
You are seeing a coterie of people that is expanding and that fears this craziness about becoming a white minority and is trying to propagate the white race in this country. And so people have said, and I must confess that I was awakened to this years ago when I was on a radio show in Chicago, a Black station, WVON, and I understood at that time the desire to propagate the white race. I mean, if you recall in Charlottesville, when Heather Heyer was killed, the digital version of the neo-Nazi newsletter said she deserved to die because she was in her 30s and had not done her obligation to further the white race by having children. What I didn't understand was, okay, if you are racist, then why are you forcing women of color? And then I understood, because of course this is enslavement. It's another form of slavery. Government forced childbirth is slavery. And you are feeding then poverty. You are keeping people in a lower economic station and fueling the prison to corporate pipeline.
Yeah. Well, the battle lines are very clearly drawn this week. You know, in the week we were making this, of course, this will have a longer life than that, but it happens that during the time frame we're having this discussion, they had a CPAC convention, the Conservative Action thing, in Hungary with Viktor Orban, who is their right-wing authoritarian president, a sort of a mirror image of Trump, but much more dangerous because Orban's smart and he's not an idiot like Trump was. And his view of white nationalism and white Christian nationalism is exactly that of Tucker Carlson and Fox News and the Murdoch family and others. And what they've been pushing now in Hungary has been a really one-party political system to, as they see it, repair the damage done by democracy in giving other points of view than white nationalism a platform. And so it's not a coincidence that in the time frame we're having this talk, you and me right now. We have the shootings in Buffalo, New York. We have the conference of CPAC, no longer held here on the shores of the United States, but in Hungary, in an authoritarian government run by Viktor Orban, who, like Bolsonaro of Brazil and Trump and others, is a real authoritarian, cast in the mold of a sort of a junior Vladimir Putin. This is all actually happening. And these folks are getting together, meeting there in Hungary to iron out what they feel is the next long-term projected scenario for achieving exactly the kind of victory they have achieved by putting a majority on the Supreme Court here. And that is really their plan. And that their plan is the plan of Ginny Thomas. And that is, they really believe in the replacement theory. They think the Democratic Party is bringing people of color into this country to vote Democratic. and so forth and so on. They have bought into this. They bought into the 2020 election having been won by Donald Trump and all the rest of it. This is far beyond the United States. This is an international movement of
international.
Very much like the 1930s, when it was Italy and Spain and Germany, British, fascists like Mosley and the others. They had international connections. Now, this is all coming back with the same sort of international connections we saw in the 1930s and the rise of fascism, although now it's a theocratic fascism. Right. It's not national socialism, it's national theocracy. It's rooted into Christian white nationalism. We need to just emphasize it's Christian white nationalism.
I do not know how we get young people to realize the dangers. I do not know how we activate them, because if they don't listen, and as I know, how many young people say, I can't handle the news, I don't listen to the news, right. And they tune it out. Right. And it's too late. I had a friend say to me, what was it like in Germany in 1939? When did you realize it was too late and you could no longer flee? And that's what we're up against now. If young people, if everybody who cares about, regardless of how conservative you may be or progressive, if you care about liberty and freedom and democracy, and I don't mean to sound Pollyannish in throwing that out, if you care about it, you must vote, because that is the last stand. If the conservative Republicans take control of the House and control of the Senate, particularly by large margins, you will see the end of every freedom, not just reproductive freedom, but everything. You will see, we are seeing it now. We are seeing an end to intellectualism. We are seeing an end to all of the progressive, with book burnings in the United States.
And I would say not even that. I don't disagree with you, but I wouldn't even call it progressive. If you rolled the clock back 50, 60 years and you asked what a normal state of affairs would be in schools or libraries to an ordinary Republican right-wing voter, they would not call having libraries free from government interference or school boards free from weird propaganda or the ability, of people to do these things in a normal way, or universities to function without a state interference. Republicans would have been on our side 50 years ago on these issues, 60 years ago. It isn't as if somehow, only the left has been protecting America's freedoms. Right. Now, and I just want to be more blunt with people listening to this. I think we have every right to say that to vote in any way on a local election or nationally for any candidate other than a Democrat right now, given what the Republican Party has become. I never would have said this even 20 years ago. I never would have said, if you vote for Republican, you are anti-American. But I think when the Republican Party has been taken over by lunatics on one side, and on the other side, very, very definite folks who have thought through their ideas in the area of Christian white nationalism and theocracy, and then you throw in a few loons on the high-tech field, running the big high-tech companies who seem to have not understood what they have unleashed on the rest of us with the social media platforms and access of these folks to those platforms. I think we have every right to say, look, if you care about these issues and you do not fight for Democratic candidates and the crushing of today's Republican Party, not all Republicans forever, but today's Republican Party, the Republican Party that came out of the Trump years, if this movement is not crushed, we are not going to be the same country, and you will lose your freedoms. And I don't. We will not be.
Exactly. I agree. It will be the end of democracy as everybody has known it. Now, it is a reversion. You are right. 50 years ago, there would have been a consensus in opposition to book banning. But let's go back to the late 19th century. Let's look at the Comstock laws. Let's look at the kinds of things that gave rise to the repression. Abortion itself was not illegal until the late 1800s. And it's worth noting, the Catholic Church did not recognize fertilized eggs or early stage embryos as human souls.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I mean, it wasn't until 1869 that the Catholic Church banned abortion. It was always permitted until quickening, which is about 5 months. So, we have a lot of hypocrisy here. And with the Catholic Church, that was also at a time when they were losing constituents and congregants to emerging Protestantism, Lutheranism, etc. So it's always been just as, with the moral majority and Falwell and your father, etc. It was always a tool with another agenda.
Yes.
The souldom of a fertilized egg became a weapon.
Yeah.
A political weapon.
And you see in the state legislatures, you already see the writing on the wall in terms of the level of extremism this is going to unleash, where, the state legislatures are already writing laws now saying that all abortion from fertilization of the egg through the end of pregnancy, any attempt at abortion will be it will now be regarded as murder. So there are state legislatures getting laws ready that not only ban abortion, but they reclassify all abortion, and that would be stopping the implantation of a fertilized egg with an IUD or whatever. There are states now on the cusp of declaring abortion murder, which means that there is no way to avoid exactly what is in the clip of your film, Birthright, a War Story, when the person there talking is saying in your clip that we saw that there's no way to escape the fact that abortion will, be punished, and in some states as murder for both the woman having the abortion or a doctor performing it. And that would include self-induced abortions with a pill. That would include certain forms of contraceptives, or a quote careless miscarriage where some woman, is prosecuted because she brought on the miscarriage upon herself, as some judge might see it. I don't think people have any idea of the extremism that is bubbling just under the surface of another kind of public extremism, but there's another level here that really boggles the mind. And so, looking forward, I just want to keep asking you what you think is going to happen next. Roe will be reversed, then what? How does this then march forward?
Well, if the Republicans take control of Congress, let's look at the federal level, I have little doubt that they are going to go for a constitutional amendment that will enshrine the personhood of a fetus at every stage of development into the Constitution.
Yeah.
And therefore, you are opening up an unbelievable holocaust, if you will, not of the fertilized egg, but of the pregnant person carrying this. I mean, what happens then? Child endangerment laws, which we have already seen utilized as a backdoor approach to establishing the personhood of the fetus, embryo, etc., are going to be used to criminalize, as we showed in the clip from the film, everybody who has a stillborn, everybody who has a miscarriage. At what point does prenatal conduct make you a, victim of government investigation? There was a county attorney in Montana who wanted everybody to report a pregnant person they saw drinking a glass of wine. We have more than, it's probably over 600. I have lost count since I did the film, but when I did the film, it was more than 500 women in Alabama who had been charged with the euphemism of child endangerment of their fetus because of behavior they engaged in during pregnancy. Remember the case of the woman whose fetus was shot in an altercation, and she was charged with the murder of the fetus because she had provoked the argument with another woman who took out a gun and shot her. So at what point here, this really is, and I am not exaggerating, this really is a Handmaid's Tale come to life.
Yeah.
And, the prescience of that book, the prescience, I must say, of our film was not fiction. You saw it coming. Margaret Edward has said many times that she began to see what was happening in the United States with the evolution of Republican politics.
And I just want to go back to one thing that we were both talking about, but I forgive me if I sound like a broken record here. But, I don't know how to put this in terms that are strong enough without sounding unhinged, but the vote for anyone but a Democratic candidate on the local or national level today is not a vote for another political party. It's not a vote for anything you would recognize as politics as usual in the United States. The ramifications are on a whole different level. It is a vote for the death of democracy as we understand it. If you vote for Republicans, you are voting against the US Constitution, our system of government, separation of powers, and you are voting for a tyranny of not just a Christian theology, but a right-wing Christian theology that up until moments ago, most Christians, including Dr. Billy Graham, or for that matter, my father, who was anti-abortion, but never foresaw this moment that we're in now, or a Dr. Criswell, or all the major conservative denominations, or even traditional Roman Catholics a generation ago could have foreseen. So, this is not another election coming up in the midterms, and it's not another election in 2024 for the presidency. And all these votes for school boards and library boards and everything else that the Republicans are infiltrating, these are not ordinary elections. We are trying to stop a revolutionary movement whose purpose is to overthrow democracy as we know it and replace it with a Christian white nationalism, which will not just marginalize anybody who's not Christian and white, but marginalize anybody who is not Christian, white, and male, and marginalize anybody who is not Christian, white, and male, and has signed up to this post-Trump era of this type of conspiratorial politics. And so, we've had decades of these dystopian movies about a very bleak future. And now we actually have the reality on, it's not just Margaret Atwood, we have been warned. And the fact that the tech moguls are so far to the right now in terms of the direction some of these guys are moving with their billions of dollars because they want to have influence within government and continue not to pay taxes and so forth is yet another wrinkle. And you see the Supreme Court even responding to that. Recent rulings of the Supreme Court have opened the door even further on anonymous massive donations in political campaigns. So even when it comes to political campaign financing, it's all moving in that direction. There's not one iota of anything moving in the direction of protecting democracy. So, at risk of sounding crazy and overstating it, the next couple of elections are the difference between democracy and theocracy. And it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen 100 years from now. We're talking now. And the overthrow of Roe is just the first shoe. So sorry, I just can't.
You're absolutely. I mean, I have been saying that. You are saying that. Others see it. We articulate it, but somehow there's a disconnect. And there's a complacency, and people do not believe that democracies crumble, which they do.
Yes, they do.
People do not believe that they are going to lose constitutional rights, which they are, and they have been eroded all along. But I think the most frightening thing is that we look at these titans of industry, if you will. We look at other people who have their own agendas. People are only concerned with their special interests. So I must say that I decry the fact that AIPAC, the American Israeli Political Action Committee, is the largest single donor of Republicans who believe in the election steal. And they fund Republicans who ban abortion. Why? Because they support Israel. Well, everybody supports Israel because it is a Middle East ally among so many other extremist states. But when people vote their self-interest, whether it's their own taxes, whether it's other agendas, then we are not concerned about the unity of a democracy.
Yeah, and I just remind people who heard you say that, and I totally agree with you, that you're someone who is Jewish yourself, but also has studied the problem of Jews within our democracy and in other cultures and so forth and so on. And AIPAC is a good example of that. And of course, you know, you have that across the board. So when you look at the way corporate America has divided their donations between Republicans and Democrats, trying to stay in good, as if they are both normal political parties, and this is business as usual. And what we've got to say to AIPAC and General Motors or anybody else is, hey guys, this is not business as usual. It's not like you're spreading your bet and you're supporting two Republicans and a Democrat here, and you've got to spread your bet because your duty is to the shareholder. All bets are off until we get past this moment of this attempt by people like Ginny Thomas to overturn an election in the name of a theocracy she's trying to impose as a white nationalist evangelical Christian. So listen, we need to wrap up this, but I want to make sure in your thinking back over what we've been talking about, Civia, that there's not something we've left unsaid here that it's like, oh, gee, we should have said that. So take a minute and just think if you would like to wrap this up on any particular note, and let's go there. And then just let me remind everybody, this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. I'm the author most recently of a book called Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy. By the way, I give a whole chapter to that of a mea culpa of my own journey away from an evangelical position of being anti-choice and really misogynist that happened many years ago to a position that I have today on these issues. Civia, what do you want to say before we get out of here, other than watch your movie, which I tell everybody they must do, Birthright, A War Story, and we'll have links to that. What would you like to say?
What I want to say is vote. Mobilize the vote. Make sure that everybody you know who can vote does so. If you have children or grandchildren, nieces, nephews who are going to be 18 by November, make sure they vote, because it is their future. It is their lives that are really at stake. And it is not an exaggeration, based on all that we've been discussing, to say that your life depends on your vote.
And there we will leave it. Civia Tamarkin, thank you for your time. Let's talk again soon and keep in touch with each other. Everyone, please go watch that movie, Birthright, A War Story. Thank you, Civia.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks a lot. Okay, bye-bye.